Jerome's world came crashing down when Maria dropped the bombshell. What he thought was a no-strings-attached night had now turned into something permanent. He'd made it clear from the start. He wasn't looking to be a father, and certainly not so soon. But Maria had made her decision, and she was keeping the baby. In the weeks that followed, Jerome struggled to come to terms with the situation. Each conversation with Maria left him feeling more trapped, the casual fling that once seemed harmless, now looming over his future. He'd leave her apartment quickly, her growing excitement clashing with his own fear and confusion. Maria seemed to glow with the idea of motherhood, while Jerome wrestled with the realization that this was no longer just about him. Then came the morning that shattered his already fragile peace. As Jerome hurried to leave after another awkward visit, Maria stopped him, her hand trembling.
"Wait,"
she said softly, holding up a positive pregnancy test, her eyes filled with a mixture of joy and apprehension.
"It worked."
Jerome's heart sank. The casual fling he had thought would fade into the past was now staring him in the face, demanding attention. Maria's face beamed with happiness, but Jerome was reeling.
"We did it,"
she whispered, tears welling in her eyes.
"We? I told you I didn't want this,"
said Jerome, his heart filled with nothing but panic. The thought of becoming a father wasn't something he could celebrate. It wasn't something he ever intended. The situation weighed heavily on him in the days that followed. What had started as a fun, carefree night had now become a life-altering decision, and Jerome was completely unprepared. He thought about his future, his freedom, and how everything had changed in an instant. The weight of responsibility grew heavier with each passing day, and despite numerous back-and-forth conversations, Jerome made it clear to Maria that he didn't want to be a father. Each time, Maria's pleas were met with Jerome's resistance. Weeks passed, and Jerome began to distance himself, ignoring Maria's messages and avoiding her calls. He figured if he pulled away, the situation would somehow resolve itself. But Maria had no intention of giving up. Frustrated and desperate, she took matters into her own hands. Unable to reach him, Maria resorted to social media, tracking down his family's details and reaching out to them directly. Jerome had no idea what she had done until one fateful morning when his phone rang. It was Maria. Her voice trembled with excitement as she shared the news.
"I told your family about the baby, Jerome."
Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. His blood ran cold, and a knot twisted in his stomach as the magnitude of her actions sank in. The walls of his carefully maintained separation were crumbling. Jerome's mind raced as he tried to process what Maria had done. His family, deeply religious and conservative, now knew about the pregnancy, and the secret he had tried so hard to keep buried was out. He never intended for them to know, let alone be involved. Yet now, with Maria's interference, his entire world was spiraling out of control. What would happen next, with the judgmental eyes of his family watching, and Maria's determination growing stronger? The thought of facing their judgment and disappointment made his stomach churn. His hands shook as he ended the call, knowing that the life he had so meticulously planned was about to unravel. Jerome was not surprised that there were consequences to his actions. He just didn't expect to see them come for him so soon. But his world was just beginning to crumble. The next few days passed in a blur of anxious anticipation. Jerome's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from family members, each notification sending a jolt of dread through his body. He avoided their calls, desperately trying to buy time to figure out how to explain the unexplainable. Finally, unable to delay any longer, Jerome found himself standing on his parents' doorstep. His mother's eyes, brimming with a mix of joy and confusion, met his.
"Jerome, baby, why didn't you tell us?"
she asked, her voice soft but laden with hurt. His father stood silently in the corner, his stoic expression masking the disappointment Jerome knew lurked beneath. Jerome's carefully rehearsed explanations died on his lips as he took in the scene before him.
I didn't know how to tell you,"
Jerome stammered, the half-truth tasting bitter on his tongue. He couldn't bring himself to reveal the true nature of his arrangement with Maria. The thought of disappointing his family further was too much to bear. His father's deep voice cut through the tension.
"Son, we raised you better than this. A child is a blessing, but also a responsibility. You can't run from your duties."
The words, delivered with a mixture of sternness and concern, struck Jerome to his core.
Jerome, we're here for you.
His mother assured, her eyes searching his face.
But you need to step up and be the man we know you can be.
That fateful day, Jerome found himself sinking deeper into expectations and obligations. His family's excitement about the impending arrival of a new generation clashed violently with the reality of his situation. With each passing moment, the weight of his deception grew heavier, highlighting the consequences of his wrong choice. When he left his parents' house that night, Jerome's mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. His family's love and support, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt like shackles binding him to a future he had never envisioned for himself. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of his newfound responsibilities, which would further launch his life into chaos. Jeremy found himself tracing another moment of conflict to the baby shower Maria organized. This had been another defining moment that sent Jeremy spiraling into his grim future filled with manipulations. Jerome's carefully laid plans had been affected by his family stepping in. But the baby shower was like a ticking time bomb, ready to bring in more chaos. The day of the shower arrived far too quickly. For some reason, Maria made sure to invite all of Jerome's relatives and family members. Jerome stood outside Maria's apartment, his hand hesitating on the doorknob. Inside, he could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the chaos. The room was a sea of pink and blue decorations, balloons floating lazily near the ceiling. Jerome's eyes darted around, taking in the scene. His mother was chatting animatedly with Maria, while his sisters cooed over tiny onesies and booties. His father stood in the corner, a proud smile on his face, as he watched the festivities. Maria spotted Jerome and waved him over, her face beaming with joy.
Jerome, come feel the baby kick.
She called out. Jerome reluctantly made his way through the crowd, acutely aware of the expectant gazes following his every move. As he placed his hand on Maria's swollen belly, he felt a small flutter beneath his palm. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. His mother appeared at his side, her eyes misty with emotion.
Oh, Jerome,
She whispered, squeezing his arm.
I'm so proud of you for stepping up like this. Your child is going to be so blessed to have you as a father.
Jerome felt his throat tighten, the weight of his deception pressing down on him. He mumbled a thank you and quickly excused himself, retreating to the relative safety of the snack table. As he mindlessly picked at a plate of finger sandwiches, he overheard his sisters discussing nursery themes and babysitting schedules.
I can't wait to be an aunt.
One of them squealed.
Jerome, have you and Maria decided on a name yet?
Jerome froze, his mind racing. He hadn't even considered names. This was all moving too fast, spiraling out of his control.
We're still discussing it.
He stammered, avoiding eye contact. As the afternoon wore on, Jerome found himself increasingly cornered by well-meaning relatives and friends. Everyone wanted to offer advice, share stories of their children, or simply congratulate him on this new chapter in his life. With each interaction, Jerome felt his resolve weakening, the emotional distance he had tried so hard to maintain crumbling away. As the party began to wind down, Jerome's father pulled him aside. The older man's face was serious, his eyes searching Jerome's.
Son,
He began, his voice low and steady.
I know this wasn't planned, but life rarely goes according to plan. Being a father, it's the greatest responsibility and the greatest joy a man can experience. I want you to know that your mother and I are here for you, every step of the way.
Jerome felt something shift inside him. The sincerity in his father's words and the unconditional support being offered all began to chip away at the walls he had built around his heart. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Jerome allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected turn of events could lead to something meaningful. It was clearly no longer just about monetary gains, and Jerome found this scary. As the last of the guests filtered out, Jerome found himself alone with Maria. She approached him, her eyes shining with unshed tears.
Thank you for being here today.
She said softly.
I know this isn't what you wanted, but I think you're going to be a wonderful father.
Jerome looked at her for what felt like the first time, drawn by what seemed like hope in her eyes, the love she already had for their unborn child. Something inside Jerome gave way. Jerome's guard had lowered, but little did he know that his world was about to be turned upside down. Jerome did not notice how drastically he had changed until Maria delivered. The doctor's magical words,
"Congratulations, it's a girl."
echoed in his mind, and at that moment, all his doubts and reservations seemed to fade away. This was his daughter, and he was her father. The realization hit him with unexpected force, filling him with a warmth he had never experienced before. As he gazed down at his daughter's sleeping face, Jerome made an impulsive decision. He wanted to mark this moment, to carry a piece of it with him, always. The next day, with the baby's name still fresh in his mind, he walked into a tattoo parlor. The needle buzzed as the artist carefully inked the name onto Jerome's arm, a permanent reminder of the day his world changed forever. Despite starting with the wrong foundation, Jerome was determined to be a committed father. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore, a lingering resentment toward Maria. Her actions, especially reaching out to his family without his permission, had fractured the fragile trust between them. While he adored his daughter, Jerome had made a decision. He would stay in his child's life, but his relationship with Maria would never be more than co-parenting. Maria, however, wasn't happy with that. At first, her discontent was subtle. Longer glances, tense silences when he didn't return her affection. She would make offhand comments like,
You don't have to pretend we're strangers, you know.
or,
It's funny how you're always here for her, but never for me.
Jerome brushed these moments aside, focusing on his daughter. But it soon became clear that Maria had hoped this child would bring them closer together, and her frustration was growing. Over the next few weeks, Jerome became more involved as a father, visiting often to see his daughter, marveling at her milestones. Each tiny achievement, the first time she gripped his finger, her first smile, filled him with a joy he never expected. But Maria's behavior began to shift. She grew more clingy, insisting he stay longer, asking personal questions, pushing for more time together as a
Family.
When he gently reminded her of their agreement, Maria's eyes would flash with something darker.
I didn't do this just to be some co-parent, Jerome.
She snapped one afternoon.
I thought you'd step up, not just for her, but for me.
Jerome, keeping his distance, brushed it off, but the signs were becoming harder to ignore. Small things, like her constant texts asking where he was or who he was with, started to feel suffocating. The walls of the arrangement they had once agreed on were closing in. Then, one afternoon, as he cradled his daughter, singing softly to her as she drifted off to sleep, Jerome realized just how much he had changed. The man who had entered into this fling, believing it was a fleeting moment, was now fully invested in his daughter's life. But he was also wary of Maria, whose unpredictable behavior was making him increasingly uncomfortable. Just as he was beginning to settle into his new role, everything took a sharp turn. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Maria. Expecting it to be about their daughter, Jerome answered, but her voice was trembling, not with the usual frustration, but with distress.
Jerome, I don't know what to do. I've lost my apartment. We have nowhere to go.
The words hung heavy in the air, a palpable weight pressing down on Jerome's shoulders. He closed his eyes, his mind racing through the implications of Maria's predicament. The logical part of him screamed to maintain the boundaries he had worked so hard to establish, reminding him that he couldn't get too involved. But the image of his daughter, vulnerable and potentially homeless, tugged at his heart with an intensity that surprised him. He knew he couldn't let her suffer. Perhaps this was the beginning of his true test as a father, and Jerome was determined to pass. His Airbnb apartment flashed through his mind, a property he had turned into a financial lifeline when he was drowning in debt. Struggling to keep up with his bills, Jerome had moved out of his home and stayed with a friend, renting out his place to make some extra money. It wasn't ideal, but it helped him stay afloat. Now, however, that safety net felt like a trap. Offering Maria the apartment meant crossing a line he had never wanted to cross. He knew it would change the dynamics of their already fragile arrangement, but what choice did he have? After what felt like an eternity, Jerome made his decision.
Maria, listen.
He began, his voice soft but steady.
I have a place you can stay. It's not much, but it's safe and clean. You and the baby can use it until you get back on your feet.
Maria's sob of relief echoed through the phone, a mix of gratitude and something else, something that made the hairs on the back of Jerome's neck stand up. He brushed it off, but deep down, he knew he was stepping into more complications than he realized. In the weeks that followed, Jerome's life began to shift. What had once been occasional visits to see his daughter quickly became regular, and the bond between them grew stronger. Each milestone, her tiny hands gripping his finger, her infectious giggles, brought him joy he hadn't anticipated. But with every visit, something unsettling was growing in the background. Maria's behavior was beginning to change. At first, it was subtle. She'd suggest that Jerome stay a little longer after his visits, offering him dinner or asking him to run errands for her.
We could spend more time together as a family,
She'd say, her eyes hopeful. Jerome, uncomfortable, would politely decline, always careful to remind her that his involvement was for their daughter, not her. But Maria didn't take his refusals lightly. Soon, her texts grew more frequent, filled with questions about his whereabouts and who he was with.
Why didn't you reply last night?
She'd ask, her tone sharper each time.
I saw you were online.
Jerome would shrug it off, telling himself she was just overwhelmed with being a new mother. But the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Her late-night messages, the way she started showing up at his friend's house unannounced, the growing possessiveness, it all left Jerome feeling trapped. Then, one afternoon, Maria took things a step further. After another visit to see his daughter, Maria insisted Jerome stay for dinner. The air between them felt tense, but she pushed, her tone taking on a more desperate edge.
You can't just come here and leave every time. It's not fair to me or to her,
she said, her voice trembling. When Jerome gently reminded her of their boundaries, Maria's expression darkened.
I didn't do all this just to be left alone.
She snapped, her frustration boiling over.
I thought this would bring us closer, Jerome. I thought you'd see we belong together.
Her words hung in the air, heavy with expectation, and Jerome knew things were spiraling out of control. The final straw came one evening when Jerome received a string of frantic texts from Maria.
She won't stop crying. I don't know what to do,
she pleaded. Jerome rushed over, fearing something was wrong with his daughter. But when he arrived, the baby was fast asleep, and Maria had prepared a candlelit dinner, waiting for him with a nervous smile.
We need to talk about this,
Jerome said, exasperation creeping into his voice. But Maria wasn't listening. She leaned in, her eyes wide and unblinking.
I need you, Jerome. You're a part of this. You have to be.
As the days passed, Maria's behavior became more erratic. She would accuse him of abandoning them if he didn't respond to her messages quickly enough, or she'd guilt-trip him into spending more time with them, talking about how their daughter
Deserved a full family.
Jerome, however, remained firm. He wanted to be a father to his child, but the idea of rekindling anything with Maria was out of the question. But Maria wasn't giving up. One night, after a particularly tense conversation, she sent him a message that sent a chill down his spine.
If you don't want to be with us, I'll make sure you regret it.
It was clear now. This wasn't about their daughter anymore. What had started as a harmless fling had turned into something darker, and Jerome found himself caught in Maria's increasingly unstable web. He knew there were no easy ways out of the mess he had found himself in, and the lines between his responsibility as a father and Maria's growing obsession were blurring fast. As the days passed, the tension between Jerome and Maria grew. Each visit became a minefield of unspoken resentment and barely concealed hurt. Maria's attempts to engage Jerome romantically became more desperate and obvious, leaving him feeling increasingly uncomfortable and trapped. But he wasn't prepared for what was to come. Following another rejection and a heated argument one afternoon, Maria finally spoke up.
Jerome,
She called, her tone icy.
if you can't give me what I want, maybe you don't deserve to be in her life at all.
The threat hung in the air, sending a chill down Jerome's spine. Was Maria really going to weaponize the love he had for his daughter? He turned to look at Maria, seeing the pain and determination in her eyes. Without a word, he left, his mind reeling from the implications of her statement. The chaos wasn't over yet. Unknown to Jerome, it was time to suffer more consequences for his weak decision to have a child for money, a decision which he would regret shortly. The days following their heated argument passed in a haze of tension and unease. Jerome found himself second-guessing every interaction and decision that had led him to this point. His visits to see his daughter became strained affairs, with Maria's cold demeanor a constant reminder of their rift. But his world was about to be further shaken. One particularly tense afternoon, Jerome arrived at the Airbnb to find Maria was about to step out. Relief washed over him at the thought of spending some uninterrupted time with his daughter. As he cradled the baby, his eyes wandered around the room, taking in the subtle changes Maria had made to the space. A notification chime from Maria's phone left carelessly on the coffee table caught his attention. Jerome hesitated, torn between respecting her privacy and the gnawing curiosity that had been eating at him since their fight. Another chime, and his resolve crumbled. With his daughter secure in one arm, Jerome reached for the phone. The screen lit up, revealing a string of text messages from someone named
Alex.
His eyes widened as he scrolled through the conversation, each message feeling like a punch to the gut.
Can't wait to see you tonight, babe. Miss you and the little one. We should really tell him soon.
Jerome's mind reeled, struggling to process the implications of what he was reading. The pieces began to fall into place. The mysterious phone calls, Maria's occasional unexplained absences, and the subtle changes in her behavior. All this time, she had been hiding a hookup, someone who seemed to know about their daughter, someone who had been a part of their lives without Jerome's knowledge. He didn't care, but found it strange that she would be pushing for them to be together when she had someone all this time. Was this just a problem of Maria keeping secrets, or was it a pointer to more hidden agendas and manipulative schemes? What were they supposed to tell him soon? What wasn't fair to keep up? The consequences of Jerome's actions were becoming more glaring. Perhaps he had become a pawn in Maria's games. Nothing was certain anymore, but at least he still had his daughter, an important factor at stake. Overwhelmed with emotions, Jerome stood, carefully placing his daughter in her playpen, before storming out, leaving a disturbing message on a written note that read,
Who's Alex?
Caught off guard by the message, Maria tried to explain Alex away over the phone. Alex had been in her life for a while now.
Maria, no.
Jerome replied, his tone flat.
It sounds like you found someone new. You guys should focus on your relationship. I told you, I just want to be in my daughter's life, and that's it.
Maria's face twisted with frustration, her voice rising in response. Anger swelled within her, but Jerome was resolute. He had tried to keep things civil, to set boundaries, but every time he did, Maria pushed back harder. She couldn't accept that his involvement would be limited to co-parenting, and as Jerome's rejection solidified, so did her bitterness. A few more weeks passed, and Maria's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. Jerome had tried to distance himself from her as much as possible while staying close to his daughter, but he sensed that things were coming to a head. The tension between them was palpable, and though Jerome didn't realize it yet, Maria had already begun planning her next move. Then, one morning, as Jerome sat at his kitchen table, a thick, official-looking envelope landed in his mailbox. He felt a strange sense of foreboding as he stared at it, his stomach tightening. With trembling hands, he tore it open, his eyes scanning the contents. The words,
Child support.
and
It's legal obligation.
jumped out at him like punches to the gut. His mind reeled as he tried to process what he was reading. This couldn't be happening. They had an agreement, a verbal contract that freed him from any child support as he was doing what he could to provide for them. Jerome's heart raced as he read through the document again, hoping he had misunderstood, but the language was unambiguous. He was being ordered to pay a significant amount in child support, effective immediately. The room seemed to spin around him as the implications sank in. He definitely fell victim to deception because of quick money. Without thinking, Jerome grabbed his phone and dialed Maria's number. Each ring felt like an eternity as his anger and confusion built. When she finally answered, her voice was cool and detached.
Maria, what is this?
Jerome demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained rage.
We had an agreement. You can't just ignore that and demand child support.
There was a pause on the other end of the line, And then Maria's calm and collected voice came through.
Things change, Jerome. Our daughter needs support, and you're her father. The court agrees with me.
Jerome felt as if he'd been doused in ice water.
The court? You went to court without even talking to me? How could you do this?
I did what I had to do for our child.
Maria replied, her tone hardening.
Your contract doesn't override her needs or your responsibilities as a father.
Jerome's mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare.
But we had a deal, Maria. You promised. You can't just change the rules like this.
I'm sorry you feel that way, Jerome.
Maria said, her voice devoid of any real sympathy.
But this is how it's going to be. If you have a problem with it, you can take it up with my lawyer.
The line went dead, leaving Jerome standing in his kitchen, the phone still pressed to his ear. He felt numb, overwhelmed by the betrayal and the sudden shift in his life's trajectory. Everything he had believed about his contract with Maria was a lie, and his choices were wrong. As the shock began to wear off, anger surged through Jerome. He paced his apartment, his mind racing with possibilities. There had to be a way to fight this, to make Maria see reason. The harsh reality began to set in. Despite their contract, despite all his intentions to remain emotionally detached, Jerome was now legally bound to provide financial support for his daughter. The court had sided with Maria, viewing their private agreement as secondary to the child's needs. As he sat in his living room, surrounded by legal papers and scribbled notes, Jerome felt a deep sense of powerlessness wash over him. He had entered into this arrangement thinking he could control the outcome and dictate the terms of his involvement. Now, he was facing a future he had never envisioned, with financial obligations he wasn't prepared for. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Jerome thought about his daughter, her innocent face unaware of the turmoil swirling around her. Despite his anger at Maria, despite feeling trapped and betrayed, he couldn't deny the love he had developed for his child. But love alone wouldn't pay the bills or protect him from further manipulation. Trusting Maria was a mistake, and Jerome needed to do something. Recovering from Maria's chaotic schemes was slow, but Jerome decided he'd move on. The memories of the manipulation and betrayals, however, tugged at him every now and then. But one evening, fate intervened as Jerome sat in a local coffee shop, trying to distract himself from his troubles. A woman's laugh caught his attention, bright and genuine amidst the low hum of conversation. He looked up to see her, dark curls framing a warm smile as she chatted with the barista. Their eyes met briefly, and Jerome felt something stir within him, a spark of interest he hadn't experienced in months. This was the beginning of a new romantic journey for Jerome and a woman named Alicia. Jerome found a way to speak to Alicia, and their conversation flowed easily. They touched on their shared love of obscure documentaries and their mutual struggles with city parking. For the first time in what felt like ages, Jerome found himself genuinely smiling, the weight of his troubles temporarily lifted. As the weeks passed, Jerome and Alicia's relationship blossomed. They explored hidden corners of the city together, shared quiet evenings watching terrible movies, and slowly, Jerome began to open up about his past. Alicia listened without judgment, offering support and understanding.
I can't imagine how difficult that must be,
She said one night, her hand resting comfortingly on his arm.
but Jerome, you're not defined by your mistakes. You're trying to do right by your daughter, and that counts for something.
Her words soothed the raw edges of his guilt and self-doubt, and for the first time, Jerome saw the possibility of redemption. He had made mistakes in the past, but he didn't have to be bound by them. Fixing things by making the right choices in the present counts for something. With Alicia, Jerome felt a sense of normalcy returning to his life. He could be himself, unburdened by the constant tension that had characterized his interactions with Maria. However, the peace Jerome had found was about to be shattered. One afternoon, as he and Alicia strolled through a local park, hand in hand, Jerome spotted a familiar figure in the distance. Maria stood frozen, her eyes locked on the couple, a mix of shock and fury etched across her face. Jerome's stomach dropped. He had known this moment would come eventually, but he had hoped for more time. Intermingling in a toxic relationship with Maria had already cost him a lot. and his fears that it might also cost him his relationship with Alicia were palpable. He squeezed Alicia's hand, bracing himself for the storm he knew was about to break. Maria's reaction was swift and explosive. She marched towards them, her voice rising with each step.
How dare you?
She hissed, her eyes blazing.
You have a child to think about, and you're out here playing happy families with someone else?
Jerome stepped slightly in front of Alicia, his voice low and steady.
Maria, this isn't the time or place for this discussion. We can talk later, privately.
But Maria was beyond reason. She turned her attention to Alicia, her words dripping with venom.
Do you know what kind of man he is? A deadbeat dad who tried to run from his responsibilities?
Alicia's hand tightened in Jerome's, but she stood her ground.
I think you should leave.
She said firmly.
This isn't helping anyone.
The confrontation ended as abruptly as it had begun, with Maria storming off, leaving Jerome and Alicia shaken. As they made their way back to Jerome's apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the stalking game. Over the next few weeks, Maria's behavior became increasingly erratic. She bombarded Jerome with text messages, alternating between pleas for reconciliation and threats to keep him from his daughter. She showed up unannounced at his workplace, causing a scene that left him embarrassed and on edge. Jerome did his best to shield Alicia from the worst of it, but the strain began to show. Their once carefree dates were now tinged with anxiety, both of them constantly looking over their shoulders, wondering when Maria would appear next.
I'm so sorry you're caught up in all this,
Jerome said one evening, his voice heavy with regret.
You didn't sign up for any of this drama.
Alicia cupped his face in her hands, her eyes filled with determination.
Hey, we're in this together, okay? I'm not going anywhere.
The situation reached a boiling point when Jerome discovered a social media smear campaign Maria had launched against him. Posts accusing him of being an abusive partner and neglectful father spread like wildfire, shared by people who knew nothing of the truth but were eager to join in the outrage. Jerome's phone rang constantly with concerned friends and family members, all asking for explanations he couldn't give. He watched helplessly as his carefully built life began to crumble around him, Maria's lies seeping into every aspect of his existence. One night, as Jerome sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through the endless stream of hateful comments, a chilling realization washed over him. This wasn't just about custody or child support anymore. Maria's obsession had taken a dark turn, and he feared what she might be capable of next. What started as a simple agreement was getting out of hand, threatening to ruin his life. No one cared about finding out the truth. They just believed what they were told. With shaking hands, Jerome began to document everything, every message, every encounter, every piece of evidence that showed the true nature of Maria's behavior. He knew he needed to take action to protect himself and those he cared about before it was too late, but more shocking revelations awaited him. Jerome sat at his desk, surrounded by the mountain of evidence he'd collected against Maria. The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach as he scrolled through the endless messages and social media posts. But as he stared at a recent photo of his daughter, something shifted in his perception. A nagging doubt that had been lurking in the back of his mind suddenly pushed its way to the forefront. Those eyes, they didn't quite match his own, did they? The shape of her nose, the curve of her smile, were they really reflections of his features, or was his mind playing tricks on him? Jerome's heart began to race as a chilling possibility took root. What if the child he'd grown to love, the center of this entire ordeal, wasn't actually his? The thought hit him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless. He pushed back from his desk, pacing the small confines of his apartment as his mind raced through every interaction, every moment with his daughter, the tattoo on his hand. Had he been so blinded by the chaos of the situation that he'd missed something crucial? Jerome's hands shook as he picked up his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. A simple DNA test could provide the answer, but did he really want to know? The truth had the power to shatter everything, to rewrite the narrative of the past year of his life. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Jerome knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he had answers. With a deep breath, he made the call. The lab technician's voice was clinical and detached as she explained the process. Jerome listened numbly, agreeing to the terms and scheduling the test. As he hung up, the weight of his decision settled over him like a heavy blanket. The next few days passed in a haze of anticipation and dread. Jerome found himself obsessively studying his daughter's features during their video calls, searching for any sign of himself in her small face. Each laugh and gesture became a potential clue, analyzed and reanalyzed until Jerome felt he was going mad. Alicia noticed the change in him, her brow furrowing with concern.
What's going on, Jerome?
She asked one evening, her hand warm on his arm.
You seem distant.
Jerome opened his mouth to explain, but the words caught in his throat. How could he voice his suspicions without them becoming real? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jerome's phone rang. The lab's number flashed on the screen, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. With trembling fingers, he answered, his voice barely above a whisper.
Hello?
The technician's words washed over him, clinical and detached. But as the results became clear, Jerome felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor as the truth sank in. The child he had grown to love, the center of this entire ordeal, was not his. Jerome's world tilted on its axis. The room spun around him as he struggled to process the magnitude of Maria's deception. Every moment, every emotion of the past year now felt tainted, viewed through the lens of this staggering betrayal. The love he had developed for his daughter warred with the anger and hurt that threatened to consume him. He sank to the floor, his back against the wall, as the full weight of the situation crashed over him. The custody battles, the child support, the constant harassment, all of it based on a lie. Jerome's mind raced through every interaction with Maria, searching for clues he might have missed. Had there been signs all along? How could he have been so blind? As the initial shock began to fade, a new emotion took its place. Determination. He had made a mistake before, but no more. Jerome pushed himself to his feet, jaw clenched as he surveyed the evidence he had gathered. This changed everything. The truth was a weapon now, one he intended to wield with precision. As difficult as it felt, Jerome decided to confront Maria. After going around in circles, she finally agreed to meet him for an hour, unaware of what was about to unfold. As Jerome drove to the small cafe where they had met so many times before, he rehearsed what he would say. The words tumbled through his mind, a jumble of anger, hurt, and betrayal. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white with the effort to maintain control. Maria was already seated when he arrived, her eyes darting nervously as he approached. Jerome slid into the chair across from her, his face a mask of calm that belied the storm raging within him.
What's this about, Jerome?
Maria asked, her voice tinged with impatience.
I thought we had an agreement about visitation.
Jerome's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching as he fought to keep his voice steady.
An agreement based on lies,
he said, the words coming out in a low, controlled tone.
I know the truth, Maria. I know she's not mine.
The color drained from Maria's face, her eyes widening in shock. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as she considered what was at stake. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, her expression hardened.
What are you talking about?
She demanded, her voice rising.
Of course she's yours. How dare you suggest otherwise?
Jerome leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper.
I have the DNA test results, Maria. It's over. Your lies, your manipulation, all of it ends now.
Maria's facade crumbled, tears welling up in her eyes.
Jerome, please.
She pleaded, reaching for his hand. He pulled away, disgust evident on his face.
You don't understand. I was desperate. I needed.
You needed what?
Jerome interrupted, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking.
To use me? To trap me in a life I never agreed to? To take advantage of my feelings for a child that isn't even mine?
The cafe around them faded into the background as years of pent-up emotions poured out. Jerome's voice shook with anger as he recounted every lie, every manipulation. Maria alternated between tearful apologies and desperate justifications, her words falling on deaf ears.
Do you have any idea what you've put me through?
Jerome demanded, his voice raw with emotion.
The stress, the anxiety, the constant fear of losing a child I thought was mine. And all for what? Your own selfish desires?
Maria's shoulders slumped, defeat written across her face.
I never meant for it to go this far.
She whispered.
I wanted a family so badly. And when I met you, I thought maybe
You could trick me into being that family.
Jerome finished, his voice cold.
Did you ever stop to think about the consequences? About how this would affect me or the child?
The silence that followed was deafening. Around them, other patrons cast curious glances their way, sensing the tension that crackled in the air. Jerome took a deep breath, forcing himself to lower his voice.
It's over, Maria,
He said, his tone final.
I'm done with your games, your lies. I'm going to fight this. The child support, the visitation, all of it. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth about what you've done.
Maria's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks.
please, Jerome,
She begged.
don't do this. We can work something out for her sake, if nothing else.
Jerome stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor.
Her sake?
He repeated, disbelief coloring his voice.
You should have thought about that before you decided to use an innocent child as a pawn in your twisted game.
With one last look of disgust, Jerome turned and walked away, leaving Maria sobbing quietly at the table. As he stepped out into the sunlight, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles and emotional turmoil. But for the first time in months, Jerome felt like he could breathe again, like he had a chance for redemption. It was time to start making calls, to begin the painful process of explaining the situation to his loved ones. But as he dialed the first number, a new resolve settled over him. He would not let this break him. Instead, he would channel his pain, his anger, and his grief into seeking justice. Jerome's quest for justice was about to thrust him into the spotlight. How would the world react to the shocking details of his case? As the lawsuit unfolded, the line between victim and villain would blur, challenging society's perceptions of parenthood and responsibility. The courthouse steps loomed before Jerome, each one feeling like a mountain to climb. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the thick manila folder containing the lawsuit. Sarah, his lawyer, stood beside him, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him.
Are you ready?
Sarah asked, her voice low and reassuring. Jerome took a deep breath, steadying himself.
As ready as I'll ever be,
He replied, his jaw set with determination. They pushed through the heavy doors, the cool air inside a stark contrast to the humid summer day outside. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the marble hallway as they made their way to the clerk's office. Jerome's heart pounded in his chest, and each beat was a reminder of the gravity of what he was about to do. Sarah efficiently handled the filing process, her practiced movements a stark contrast to Jerome's nervous energy. As she handed over the documents, Jerome felt a mix of relief and apprehension wash over him. There was no turning back now. The lawsuit laid out multiple charges against Maria. Fraud took center stage, detailing how she had knowingly misled Jerome about the paternity of the child. The emotional distress charge painted a vivid picture of the psychological toll Maria's deception had taken on Jerome. Defamation was included as well, addressing the damage done to Jerome's reputation through Maria's social media smear campaign. Perhaps the most jarring part for Jerome was the demand for compensation. It felt strange to put a price tag on the pain and suffering he had endured. The back child support payments he had made, believing the child to be his, were listed in black and white. Seeing the numbers laid out so clinically brought home the financial toll of Maria's lies. As they left the courthouse, Jerome noticed a small group of reporters gathered near the steps. His stomach churned as he realized the media attention his case was already attracting. Sarah placed a protective hand on his arm, guiding him past the shouted questions and flashing cameras.
Mr. Thompson, can you tell us about the lawsuit you've just filed?
Is it true that you're suing for paternity fraud?
How do you respond to allegations that you're abandoning your child?
The questions hit Jerome like physical blows, each one a reminder of how public his private pain had become. He kept his head down, following Sarah's lead as they made their way to her waiting car. Once inside, Jerome let out a shaky breath.
I didn't expect them to be here already,
he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's expression was sympathetic, but firm.
This is just the beginning, Jerome. Cases like these often attract media attention. We need to be prepared for the scrutiny that's coming.
Jerome nodded, his mind racing. Intellectually, he had known that filing the lawsuit would make his story public, but the reality was far more overwhelming than he had anticipated. His private struggles, his pain, and his betrayal would now be dissected and debated by strangers. As they drove away from the courthouse, Jerome's phone buzzed incessantly. Messages from friends and family poured in, some offering support, others demanding explanations. He turned the device off, unable to face the onslaught of emotions just yet. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts.
We have a strong case, Jerome. The evidence is compelling, and Maria's actions are clearly documented. But I want you to be prepared for a difficult journey ahead. This won't be easy, emotionally or legally.
Jerome met her gaze, seeing the concern in her eyes.
I know,
He said softly.
but I have to do this, not just for myself, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. Someone needs to stand up and say this isn't okay.
The courtroom buzzed with tension as Jerome took his seat beside Sarah, his lawyer. The polished wood of the gallery benches felt cold and unyielding beneath him, a stark contrast to the warmth of the supportive hand Alicia placed on his shoulder before taking her place in the audience. Jerome's eyes darted around the room, taking in the stern-faced judge and the curious spectators, and finally landing on Maria, who sat across the aisle with her own legal team. As the bailiff called the court to order, Jerome's heart pounded in his chest. Months of preparation had led to this moment, yet he felt woefully unprepared for the emotional onslaught that lay ahead. Sarah stood, her posture confident as she addressed the court. Her opening statement painted a vivid picture of deception and manipulation, her words weaving together the threads of evidence they had so carefully gathered. Jerome watched as the judge's expression shifted from neutral interest to furrowed concentration. Each piece of evidence Sarah presented seemed to land with the weight of truth. Text messages flashed on screens, their contents damning in their clarity. Social media posts, once weapons in Maria's arsenal, now stood as a testament to her campaign of manipulation. When it came time for Maria's defense, Jerome steeled himself. Her lawyer spoke of misunderstandings and good intentions gone awry, but the words rang hollow in the face of the mountain of evidence against her. Jerome's stomach churned as he watched Maria take the stand, her eyes brimming with tears as she recounted her version of events.
I just wanted a family.
Maria sobbed, her voice trembling.
I never meant to hurt anyone.
Jerome clenched his fists at his sides, anger bubbling up inside him. The judge's gaze was unreadable as he listened to Maria's testimony, his pen scratching notes on the pad before him. As the trial progressed, Jerome found himself reliving every painful moment of the past year. Each memory, once tainted by confusion and betrayal, now stood in stark relief under the harsh light of legal scrutiny. He described the joy he had felt at becoming a father, the crushing weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders, and the devastating moment when he learned the truth.
I loved her,
Jerome said, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke of the child he had believed was his.
I still do, but everything I thought I knew was built on lies.
The judge leaned forward, his eyes sharp, as he questioned Jerome about the impact of Maria's deception. Jerome spoke of sleepless nights, the strain on his relationships, and the constant fear that had become his companion. As he spoke, he felt a shift in the courtroom, a palpable sense of understanding settling over the gallery. The judge cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the hushed courtroom. His sharp and discerning eyes swept across the room before settling on the papers before him. Jerome's heart pounded in his chest, and each beat was a reminder of how much was hinged on this moment.
In the case of Thompson v. Ramirez,
the judge began, his voice steady and authoritative.
This court has carefully considered all evidence presented by both parties. The implications of this case extend far beyond the individuals involved, touching on fundamental questions of parental rights, responsibility, and the very definition of family in our modern society.
Jerome's breath caught in his throat. He felt Sarah's reassuring hand on his arm, grounding him as the judge continued.
The plaintiff, Mr. Jerome Thompson, has provided compelling evidence of intentional deception on the part of the defendant, Ms. Maria Ramirez. The DNA test results, coupled with the extensive documentation of Ms. Ramirez's actions, paint a clear picture of paternity fraud and emotional manipulation.
A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the sharp rap of the judge's gavel. Jerome's mind raced, hope and fear battling for dominance as he clung to each word.
This court finds in favor of the plaintiff,
the judge declared, his words like a thunderclap in the silent room.
Ms. Ramirez is hereby ordered to repay all child support payments made by Mr. Thompson. Furthermore, given the emotional distress caused by her actions, additional damages are awarded to Mr. Thompson in the amount of $150,000.
The words washed over Jerome like a wave, relief and vindication flooding through him. He felt lightheaded, barely registering Sarah's triumphant smile or the excited whispers erupting around him. The judge's voice continued, outlining the details of the ruling, but Jerome found himself lost in a whirlwind of emotions. As the reality of the verdict sank in, Jerome's eyes stung with unshed tears. He had won. The truth had prevailed. Yet beneath the joy, a bittersweet ache lingered. No amount of money could erase the pain of the past year, the loss of a child he had loved as his own. The judge's final words cut through Jerome's tumultuous thoughts.
This case highlights the urgent need for clearer legislation surrounding paternity fraud and the rights of non-biological parents. It is the hope of this court that today's ruling will serve as a catalyst for much-needed reform in family law.
With a final rap of the gavel, the proceedings were concluded. The courtroom erupted into a cacophony of voices, reporters rushing to file their stories, lawyers conferring in hushed tones. Jerome remained seated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just transpired. Sarah turned to him, her eyes shining with pride and satisfaction.
You did it, Jerome.
She said softly.
You stood up for yourself and for everyone who's ever been in your position. This is a landmark decision.
Jerome nodded, still struggling to find his voice. He looked across the aisle, catching a glimpse of Maria's tear-stained face as her lawyers led her away. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jerome saw a flicker of remorse in her gaze. But it was too little, too late. The damage had been done, and lives were irrevocably changed. As Jerome finally rose from his seat, a strange mix of emotions washed over him. Relief, certainly, and a sense of justice served. But there was also a hollow ache in his chest, a reminder of the child he had loved and lost. No court ruling could fill that void. Jerome sat in his apartment, the weight of the past year finally lifting from his shoulders. The courtroom victory felt surreal, a vindication of his struggle against Maria's web of lies. He thought back to the moment he signed that fateful agreement, never imagining the chaos that would ensue. His journey had been a crucible, testing his resolve and forcing him to confront hard truths about trust and responsibility. The pain of losing a child he had come to love still ached, a wound that would take time to heal. But Jerome felt stronger now, more certain of who he was and what he stood for. Despite his initial mistakes, he had been redeemed and was a better person. He had learned his lesson and would make careful decisions going forward. As he looked to the future, Jerome knew his path forward wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to use his experience to help others, to fight for clearer laws and greater protections for those caught in similar situations. In the face of deception, he had found the courage to stand up for justice, no matter the cost.